Welcome to the continuation of the Roundtable Dialogue of the Focus in Continuity series. Many of our viewers would already know that the Focus in Continuity is a foreign policy framework of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Malaysia, in a post-pandemic world. Today, our topic is cultural diplomacy, which I am sure will provide to be a riveting discussion, not least because it is a topic that we can identify with. It is a topic that beckons to each and every individual of a country, and it is a topic that goes to the heart and soul of a nation. It will also be a riveting discussion because of the lineup of panelists that we have with us today. So here, at the studio of the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations, we have Mr. Edin Khoo, founder of Pusaka, an organization that focuses on the traditional performing arts of Malaysia, ensuring its survivability for successive generations of Malaysians. A former journalist, Edin has written extensively on cultural traditions and is also the founder of publishing house Kala, which devotes itself to publishing works of literature into Malay. We also have Dr. Asma Abdullah, who is no stranger to cultural interactions, specializing in intracultural and intercultural communications. She is an academician, a trainer, and understands full well the challenges of culture at the international level. Dr. Asma has a PhD from Universiti Kebangsaan Malaysia, one MSc from the University of Southern California, another MSc from University Malaya, and her bachelor's from Monash University in Melbourne. And online, speaking to us virtually, is Professor Dr. Osman Bakar, who is the holder of the Al-Ghazali Chair at the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, ISTAC, at the International Islamic University of Malaysia. His PhD is from Temple University, Philadelphia, and he received his master's and bachelor's in mathematics from the University of London. Professor Osman has held distinguished positions in Brunei Darussalam, at Georgetown in Washington, DC, and of course here in Malaysia. And I am Shazlina Zainul Abidin of the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Malaysia. Welcome to all speakers and to the viewers who are watching us both here on AWANI as well as online. Now, cultural diplomacy is not a new concept in international relations. It gained popularity in value when in 1954, the UN understood full well the value of popular culture and appointed actor, singer, comedian Danny Kaye as its first UN Goodwill Ambassador. In fact, as far back as 1954, the US State Department had already provided a definition of cultural diplomacy, talking specifically about how it is contact between peoples and omitting altogether the government machinery. Fast forward to 60 years later, and we see that there is an explosion of what people understand to be cultural diplomacy. You talk about Japanese cuisine, you talk about Bollywood movies, about K-pop, about pandas as diplomats. Not to mention Germany's Academic Exchange Service, the Alliance Francaise, the Montreal Jazz Festival, and the Rainforest World Music Festival. And so non-great power states understood that cultural diplomacy could be used as a soft power in foreign policy, by which to project their country's image. It is the idea that cultural diplomacy can influence the perception of a people about that country, and in so doing, allows that country to better pursue its national interests on the world stage. Now that's the diplomat talking. We need to hear from our panelists. So let's talk to them. Let's talk about cultural diplomacy in Malaysia's context. One of the ways that the framework Focus in Continuity talks about as per cultural diplomacy, and I'd like to quote here, is to promote Malaysian culture in a manner that allows for long-term continuity. So let me pose this question to all three panelists. What is Malaysian culture? Is there even a consensus about what that means? And what do you understand when we say promoting Malaysian culture abroad? Can we go to Professor Osman first?
Thank you, Sazina, my fellow panelists, Adine, Ku, and Sasma. Thank you to the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations for inviting me to this program. Now, to the question, what we understand by Malaysia's cultural diplomacy, let me say this before we describe what Malaysia's cultural diplomacy is. Let us try to first understand what we mean by cultural diplomacy, and also to say a few words about his historical background. There is no precise meaning of the word cultural diplomacy on which you all could agree. One good reason for the disagreements on the subject is that different nations have different historical experiences of cultural diplomacy and also different perspectives on the significance of cultural diplomacy. In its broad outlines, however, there is at present a convergence of understanding of the nature and scope of cultural diplomacy. I will say a little more shortly about this convergence of divergence, convergence of understanding. But now I like to briefly touch on the modern history of cultural diplomacy, because I think Malaysia's cultural diplomacy may best be understood when viewed in the light of this historical background. In the colonial period, Western nations had already developed theories and practices of cultural diplomacy to be at the service of their respective foreign policy goals in the political climate of intra-Western rivalry. In the cultural domain, of which education is the core component, each Western country was pursuing policies that were meant to demonstrate that it is better than and superior to all the other Western powers. Each Western country was pursuing policies that were meant to demonstrate that. And each Western country was also pursuing policies that would help it to establish its lasting cultural influence on its colonies. As for the colonies themselves, they were only on the receiving ends as far as the cultural flows were concerned. The growth of indigenous culture was only tolerated to the extent that it was subservient to Western culture. In reality, however, the flow, the cultural flow, was a one-way phenomenon. Now, in the post-colonial era, I think the classical definition of cultural diplomacy survived. According to this definition, this old definition, classical definition, cultural diplomacy designates a policy area or branch of public diplomacy in which states seek to mobilize their cultural resources to achieve foreign policy goals. I think certainly the definition was very much applicable to the colonial period, but it was still in use. But from that definition, you can see the fact that it sounds the tone of in the definition is that it is a kind of unilateral thing. It is not a two-way flow. In each country, and basically the major powers, for example, try to mobilize their cultural resources to the best possible, to the greatest extent possible, to achieve their foreign policy goals. So the definition sounds quite as I said, it's kind of unilateral things. It's more aggressive. It's up to the country concerned, how to best use its resources. But in the case of the newly independent countries, they still they're still guided. They're still guided. For example, Malaysia, let's say during the first decade of its independence, it was basically, if there's such a thing as cultural diplomacy, it was guided by this definition. Except that, of course, each newly independent country will try to interpret what cultural resources means and what the foreign policy goals are. So if you take Malaysia as an example, of course, I think in the beginning, it's question of the scope of what is the meaning of culture. So it's not surprising that in the early years, uh, the uh, the cultural diplomacy was limited to things like music, dancing, dress, cuisine, and buildings, and religious festivals, and those kind of things. And of course, the performance arts and so on. But limited to that. So it's based on the cultural, based on the popular understanding of culture at the time, but it is limited. It is only later that we see a kind of expansion of the range of cultural resources in Malaysia. So, in short, I think from the beginning of its independence, there was cultural diplomacy carried out by Malaysia, but it was limited to the popular culture. So I think we have more recently another definition, which is basically the current definition. Cultural diplomacy is the exchange of ideas, information, values, systems, traditions, beliefs, and other aspects of culture with the intention of promoting mutual understanding. I emphasize mutual understanding. So you can see that in terms of emphasis, a big difference between the other definition and this second definition. Now, therefore, perhaps from here we can move this exchange of ideas. We emphasize the idea of dialogue. Yeah. But one thing I would like to emphasize here is that the range of the cultural resources now has become very, very large. In fact, so large that what we call culture in its broader sense is none other than what we scholars call civilization. In other words, it is possible not to talk about civilizational diplomacy. Of course, it makes a lot of sense in the context of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization, because the opposite to that, the antithesis of that is precisely civilizational, mutual civilizational understanding between nations. So I think I see Malaysia's evolving evolving cultural diplomacy that sees the expansion, and with that, we see the roles of Malaysian embassies abroad, with various agencies to help realize this diplomacy, particularly education. At one time, of course, it's kind of one-way traffic again in terms of education. Malaysia sends students to different parts of the world, but today Malaysia is receiving students. So it's that, and education is a very, very important aspect of cultural diplomacy. So that's my initial response to that, Sazina.
Thank you, Professor Osman, for that enlightening perspective. And you have given us a very good foundation because you've opened up the scope to infinite possibilities when it comes to cultural diplomacy. Let's turn to our panelists here at the studio. Dr. Asma, the same question to you. What is Malaysia's cultural identity, and what do you understand when we say we are promoting Malaysian culture abroad?
Thank you, Dr. Shazlina. Salam sejahtera and good day, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my perspective about Malaysia and what we have to offer to the world. It is really our persona to the region and to the world. And when someone asks you, what has Malaysia got to offer, sometimes it can be difficult because it depends where you're coming from. We know that Malaysia is highly diverse. So our perspectives about Malaysia will also be diverse. So I think it's being able to have a coherent, consistent picture of Malaysia is sometimes quite challenging. Now, based on my work with foreigners as well as diplomats, young diplomats in IDFR, I find that it is very important for us to understand our own culture. Yeah? So when you're talking about cultural diplomacy, the first thing is to understand your own self, before you understand others. I think Professor Osman has shared with us the historical perspective about Malaysia and where we are located in this part of the world. And I find that a lot of people who come to Malaysia are amazed at the things that we have. And I think this is where we need to mine those things. We need to find out what are things that delight foreigners, that we are proud to showcase, and also some of the things that may irritate them too, So I find that it is important for us to take stock of what is Malaysian culture before we can talk about cultural diplomacy.
So that means it depends on who you are speaking to when it comes to Malaysian culture, not only where you're coming from, but who you're speaking to and what you want to showcase.
Yeah, exactly. Because of our multicultural diversity, you'll find that the perspective of a Malay about Malaysia is very different from Chinese, Indian, others, Bumiputra. So I think we need to come to some landing in terms of who is a Malaysian. And this is what I feel that it is work in progress because we keep changing the boundaries. Yeah, and this is where I feel that there has to be a cohesive message by all ministries who are promoting Malaysia abroad to have a consistent view about who is a Malaysian.
Thank you, Dr. Asma. You've just made our work at the Foreign Ministry a little bit harder. Okay, Mr. Edin Khoo, you have been so steeped in cultural traditions. You promote it. You ensure that it is there for successive generations. What would you call Malaysian culture?
Well, to start off with, I don't do any of those things.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I study. I study and document our ritual traditions.
Okay.
I think we need to challenge this concept of Malaysian identity and cultural diplomacy a great deal more. Firstly, is there a Malaysian identity? Of course, but it's not reflected in nationality necessarily. It's not reflected in the way our society is organized politically. It has a far deeper resonance and goes far deeper back into our historical reality. So essentially, the characteristics of a Malaysian culture, of course, is its cosmopolitanism. It's a cosmopolitan culture, and it's very organic in nature and always has been. This is not something that is imparted to us on a daily basis, considering so much of our imagination is actually shaped by what we see politically. So cultural diplomacy has to go beyond that. I'd also like to challenge some of the encapsulations of how we understand cultural diplomacy. Okay. Cultural diplomacy is really not about selling and promoting our country abroad. Cultural diplomacy is essentially about, as Prof said, very much about education and knowledge in all spheres. We have commemorated 50 years, for example, of one of the most pivotal foreign policy events of the last century, which is the establishment of relations between China and the United States. A hugely, hugely crucial event that has then defined world politics since that time. And remember that the first phase of that relationship was a ping pong match. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
But a ping pong match really was the first reflection of a lot, essentially, of interaction and understanding and study and cultural understanding that needed to be forged before that ping pong match could happen. A lot of cultural diplomacy has been defined by places like the United Nations and the United States. Remember that Cornell University, for example, established its great Southeast Asian program, which did a lot to define American understanding of what Southeast Asia was. Essentially a foreign policy venture that even kind of dipped into things like intelligence. Yeah? So cultural diplomacy even goes into areas of that kind. But essentially what it is, it's to create cultural understanding for aspects of basically solidarity or even conflict resolution and behavioral patterns of other cultures. I often very much like to fall back on something that's very much forgotten now, which is the resolution and the agreement that was brought about in Bandung about 50 years ago between third world nations, about how essentially we should be able to come together and through a process of mutual understanding and mutual solidarity, begin to grapple with this idea of how cultures can share. Culture transcends politics. Yeah, culture is really has a great deal more resonance, and that's why in Malaysia, for example, we constantly have we are constantly grappling or battling with cultural issues because while they influence our lives so much, we don't necessarily acknowledge the power of culture. So I think our cultural diplomacy has to be shaped along those lines and really not about selling or promoting Malaysian culture, Malaysian food. All that is part and parcel, no doubt, but it's not the heart of the matter. And if cultural diplomacy is going to be pivotal to Malaysia's approach to foreign relations, I think we better start having a far more serious and profound understanding of what it is and what its resonance can be everywhere else.
You know, there's also one school of thought that talks about how cultural diplomacy, when it is wielded by governments, it then becomes propaganda. And it's more effective when it is done by the people, by the non-state actors. In your own experience, would you say that this is somewhat true? That if we were to move towards having a foreign policy that is so focused on cultural diplomacy, then it turns into a propaganda and then it loses its effectiveness? Yeah,
it requires a great deal of intelligence, of course. And it requires a great deal of everything from a great deal of learning, yeah? So language instruction, for example. The promotion of Malaysian studies in universities abroad, which we were at one time very, very prominent with. My alma mater, for example, the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London, was essentially set up by a British administrator for the promotion, really, of the understanding of the Malays. His name was Richard Winstead. I think he's very well known. The Malay language, promotion of the Malay language, and so on. But we have not invested a great deal in sustaining these efforts all around the world. I think Malaysia needs to look back at its own foreign policy, or foreign policy trajectories over the past 50 years, and come to understand that so much of our cultural resources, linguistically, in terms of population demographic, in terms of diversity of our culture, have allowed Malaysia, a nation of about 32 million people, now, smaller before, to really punch above our weight, yeah?
Correct. Thank you very much. We'll take a break now for a few minutes and we'll come back with more questions for the panelists. Welcome back. Since we are talking about focus and continuity, which is a framework of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a post-pandemic world. So I need to bring this back to reality and bring it to the 21st century. We've gone through the theory, we've gone through the ideas of what makes up cultural diplomacy. Let's look at how we can promote diplomacy as a whole and whether the digital era has made it more challenging for us, or has it made it much easier for us, taking into account that we are not the only players out there. As Professor Osman said, competing interests, competing countries. So the competition is great. So let's go to Professor Osman. The digital era. Has it made diplomacy easier for Malaysia, or has it made it much more challenging for us to promote our interests abroad?
Hello, Sasina. Yes, to the question. You know, if we are to compare our achievements with many of the developing countries, I think we have done much better. And and I will say that the Malaysia has been one of the most digitalized countries, you know, as they say, United States, you know, one of the most wired, you know, communities in the world. Of course, in comparison with the more advanced countries, there are gaps, but we are catching up. Yeah? So I think, for just to give you an example, when I went to many countries, talk about, say, our capital, Putrajaya, right? Going for kind of, it is a city, a capital city, a modern capital city, which is carrying an e-governance, you know. That is a great achievement for in the eyes of many countries in Asia and in Africa. Malaysia is an advanced country when it comes to digital technology, and of course we have to maintain that achievement because it is a very competitive field and competitive technology. Things some countries can catch up in a very short space of time because that is the kind of technology that we are dealing. So we have to be very careful. But since we are talking about cultural diplomacy, therefore, what is the relevance? What is the significance of having an advanced digital technology? I think the thing that IDFR or Ministry of Foreign Affairs of our country should be addressing. In other words, actually, it opens up a lot of possibilities. You know, in terms of a great abundance of opportunities for Malaysia to enhance its cultural diplomacy by using the digital technology that is available to us. Uh, uh, I mean, we know what these opportunities are, certainly in education, right? In other words, if you were to go to advance to greater heights in the field of education, then we have to be on par with the countries. Uh, Basically, education is a product, is a cultural product uh, that were competing against each other in the coming decades. So how can maintain our advantages now? Should not lose that opportunity. I think that's my the response to that question. Significance of digital technology for uh, the future of Malaysia's cultural diplomacy.
Thank you, Professor Osman. Mr. Edinku, have we used the digital era to our advantage when it comes to diplomacy?
Digital is a skill, and I think a lot of that skill needs to be developed in our particular context. But I must say also that I find that we are extremely uncritical when we approach the digital, anything digital. Digital seems to be the new opium, yeah, that makes everybody kind of drunk with every jargon and every, fourth industrial revolution and so on. Yeah, but we seem to be so uncritical when we approach any of these things. Remember, in the digital age, we are beginning to confuse information with knowledge, yeah? Information is not knowledge, knowledge is not information. And along with information, in the digital age comes misinformation and disinformation, which are also of serious concern. So I think for us to really exploit, we need to have technical skills, But we also have to have a very strong knowledge base, to employ the digital technology to our advantage.
Okay. Dr. Asma, your views on this?
Yeah, digital technology is the way to go. It is the new tool that we need to acquire and have mastery, in terms of using it to benefit our cultural diplomacy initiatives. I've been fortunate to tune in to a number of cultural expressions by a neighboring country in the ASEAN region where they publicize their symbols as well as their cultural practices online. And as you know now, what you have, you can publicize it to the whole world.
Dr. Asma, when you say symbols,
Symbols like, for example, this particular country had demonstrated the use of the sarong.
okay.
So how you use the sarong, right? So in other words, you can mount a program on virtual platform and you can broadcast it to the entire world. So I think this is the way to go when you talk about expressing the richness of our culture. And digital tool is certainly the way to go. Now, I also have friends who are in the guiding, tour guide. Now they are going onto the virtual platform to advertise the whole world. So for example, if I am from Malaysia, I can take the camera, go to Chinatown, go to all the historical sites in the country and publicize what we have. So we can do it with our literature, with our arts, with our songs, with our symbols, and all the things that we want to showcase to the world. So the digital tool is the way to go, and we need to really harness it.
I think that's a good idea because no more virtual, it's more virtual walking tours. And I know during the pandemic, a few museums did virtual tours, which promoted some of the paintings that they had.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, we'll ask Professor Osman one last question and all the panelists as well. And this comes back to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. From your own viewpoint, where you are sitting, is there anything more that you would suggest if you were an ambassador, if you were a diplomat abroad? What else, what other things, what other initiatives would you promote to ensure that we do a lot more in terms of cultural diplomacy abroad?
Well, I think in today's world, where a lot of there are so many changes and many of them are negative as far as cultural relations are concerned, I think it is still worth it and still very, very important for our missions abroad to serve, in a sense, to present our achievement. I still think that we have not really done everything to tell the world what our achievements have been since independence in terms of our cultural life, cultural relations. We of course we realize. I mean, we are not perfect. There's so many there are failures, but also many successes, and we it is important to present these successes when negative developments are taking place in the Western capitals, in the Western countries themselves. In I think the in other words, the Malaysia's achievement of being a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, a country that is trying its best to achieve unity in diversity. So Malaysia is a kind of unique, pluralistic country with unique characteristics. What I mean is in terms of the demographic character, in terms of the political institutions, in terms of the religious diversity. Not to take one of these items separately, but to look at all these things together as one whole an entity. So Malaysia is has that uniqueness. Yeah. So when in the West, there's a lot of extremism going on. Extremism is not to be directed only at people outside Europe, but a lot of phenomena that can be regarded as extremists, as kind of anti-civilization even, are growing in the Western capital. That actually, as far as I'm concerned, as when it comes to intercultural relations, the West is not a model for us. We should be the model for others because we have proof that in terms of our cultural literacy, we need to do more for cultural literacy in our own society. But I can tell you, having lived for many years in the West, Western cultural literacy is much lower than cultural literacy in our own country. So my point is that there are still so many things that we can tell the world what Malaysia has achieved in terms of this cultural, I say cultural life and enhancement. So thank you.
I fully agree with you, Professor Osman. Malaysia's story is one that needs to be told, or perhaps told better. So the Malay culture of shying away from extolling your own virtues has no place in diplomacy. So Dr. Asma, what kind of suggestions? What suggestions would you have for Malaysia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs when it comes to promoting Malaysia abroad, especially in terms of cultural diplomacy?
You know, when you look at Malaysia, we are probably the only country that celebrate religious festivals and give public holidays.
We have a lot of public holidays.
A lot of public holidays. When foreigners come here, they say, why so many public holidays revolving around religious affiliation, right? Mm-hmm. So this is, to me, our symbol. And also, because we celebrate many religions, what does it communicate? So the values that are important in all religion are communicated in Malaysia. You know, we are expressing it in our daily life. So I think this is where we need to start, by looking at the common symbols that we have among all the races in the country. Because as you know, advertising Malaysia is difficult because of our multicultural setup. Yeah? So I think we need to locate symbols that unite us. Yeah? And this is where I think we need to do a lot more work, a lot more research in terms of trying to tell the world that we have a unique culture. You come to Malaysia, you see truly Asia. You know, I have friends who come here, who work here because they find that the diversity in the country is amazing. And when they go back to their country that are homogeneous, they will be able to share their experience. And then I have friends who bring students here for almost 10 years. And when I ask her, she's a professor in business, she said she has to attach her students to different organizations in the country. And when I asked her, why do you keep bringing students here? And she said, this is the only country where you come and you have a feel for Asia. Yeah? So there are many foreigners who come here to learn about our diversity. And this is where I find that if you want to promote, you want to project Malaysia, you've got to be inclusive, not Malay promoting Malay culture. Mm-hmm. I think we need to recognize the contribution of, say, for example, Ramli Ibrahim, you know, who is promoting Indian culture. And then you have a Malay promoting Chinese culture. So you got to go into that arena of intercultural competence. Yeah? Otherwise, we will be just shock sendiri about our own culture. And people will see it as, yeah, you would be promoting your own culture. But now in Malaysia, you see that intercultural display of understanding, mutual cooperation, collaboration. And I think the uniqueness about Malaysia is that we are very friendly. Yeah, that's why people come here. Very easy to do business. So indirectly, cultural diplomacy will have an indirect impact on tourism, on education, on trade and commerce, and many more.
We just need to advertise ourselves better.
Exactly. We just need to do a good job about promoting ourselves.
Mr. Adinku, your opportunity to tell the Foreign Ministry, what else can we do?
I'm just getting a little confused here because, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is a hugely crucial arm of the Malaysian government. It is not, it should not be doing the business of the Ministry of Tourism and Malaysian tourism. Cultural diplomacy is a hugely important aspect of Malaysia's, foreign policy reach. Also a voice for us to have a major say, essentially, in very essential things that are happening in the world. And more important now than ever before, because we have the cultural experience. I take on from what Prof said. Intercultural understanding is a major problem in the world today. We should be saying a lot more, which we are not doing. Because we have that wealth of experience. We are a cosmopolitan culture, we are an organic culture. I have nothing against Malaysia, truly Asia, but really it's really quite shallow. And I think we need to take it far deeper. Remember the role that Malaysia has played on foreign affairs, in the United Nations, in peacekeeping efforts. These things need to be remembered, and they have to forge part of our institutional memory as we begin to shape, our understanding of cultural diplomacy. It's all well and good, and even when we promote Malaysian culture elsewhere, I don't think we have, as Prof says, the cultural literacy to actually explain what these things are. Wayang kulit is not a matter of song and dance. It is a representation of the Malay Kelantanese worldview, philosophy, of also historically about how Malay culture is forged up of so many different components, what cultural influences have been. I think we have to really go beyond the very gestural things that we do. I'm often asked the question, as a non-Malay, how come you're so involved in Malay culture? My family has lived here for 4 generations, and on my father's side, 6 generations. My father is from a Peranakan family who speak Malay. Malay culture is my culture. It is not the culture of the Malays that I'm interested in. And I think when we start to acknowledge that that is our cultural reality, all of us in Malaysia, and stop, having this insulating Puritan approach to my culture and your culture and whatever not. Even today, as we are discussing things like language, what kind of a language should be promoted, what kind of language should Malaysia use overseas and so on. It's never to challenge the sovereignty of the national language. But we are a country where every Malaysian should already be trilingual. And here we are battling over, what language we should speak. So I don't think we are using our resources, our innate resources, as a culture and, to use Prof's term again, a civilization, to really forge what our policy approaches should be. And so I think in this, we are putting the horse before the cart and wondering what our embassies overseas should do, when first I think we need to clarify very clearly what we mean by cultural diplomacy, and then what kind of role we can play advocating essentially what the world is facing now, which is how do cultures come together, how do they protect rights of minorities, and these are things that we have so much experience with, and we should be talking on the top platforms of the world as we were doing, 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
This is what I think Dr. Asma was talking about, coherence, and then being able to project it abroad.
Yeah.
I do have to take a number of questions from the audience, so I will open this riveting discussion. I can't go down a lot of the rabbit holes that are already there.
Oh. All right, I'm Amalina from Wisma Putra. This question is dedicated to any of the panelists. Without human rights or fundamental rights, it's impossible to practice cultural diplomacy. So my question would be, are the ideas and cultural identity that Malaysia has been portraying complements or reflects our values and rights?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find about the issue of human rights, it is probably a challenge or what do you call it, initiative that comes from cultures which are more individualistic. Yeah, I find that collectivistic cultures are not so involved in championing human rights. Of course, unless you are exposed to studying in the West, in foreign universities who are championing human rights. But I think generally collectivistic Asian societies, the vocabulary is a bit different. So when you're championing human rights, you've got to make sure that what exactly do you mean? Because the concept of human rights from the perspective of Western scholars and Asian scholars, for that matter, unless they are trained overseas, are quite different. I think this is where I find that when groups champion human rights, you've got to be very careful about how you do it and what do you mean really. Yeah, because our culture is very collectivistic. We are harmony driven. We don't challenge our elders. Yeah, so if you're talking about human rights, you have to be very careful about how you articulate your thoughts that will be received well by the audience. Otherwise, you create stress. To champion something that is not palatable to the majority of the population.
Okay.
That's an interesting question. It's a great challenge because it does pose, again, as we have been talking, how do we shape and broaden essentially the conversation about things like human rights? I agree with Asma that there are very different approaches, but I also have to say that in many of our collectivist cultures, we are deeply, deeply authoritarian, and intolerant, essentially of minority voices and so on. So I think we have to have a very critical approach to universal things, but there's absolutely no way, of course, that we can push aside the concept of universal human rights. I think we cannot also fall back on being too legalistic. I think sometimes friends in the legal department think that everything abides by the legal edict. There are so many other dimensions that are so important, culture being the principal one. But nevertheless, I do not like to, I think it's a hazard to take a Western versus Eastern approach, as we know Asian values and things like that. On the one hand, there was a lot to actually grapple with and learn from. On the other hand, it was a complete hypocrisy because it basically allowed or vindicated authoritarian regimes from behaving the way they did. So I think it's a very complicated question. It doesn't go away, and I think we need to be shaping it as we go along. These things are organic, yeah. They're not black and white. So much of the world, as we are coming to learn, is about the gray, and culture is a lot about the gray. So the moment we develop more sophisticated understanding and approaches and methodologies to this, I think the further we go.
Okay, Professor Osman.
Hello, Selena. To the question, I just want to raise this issue. I think in the coming years, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our professional diplomats, need to prepare themselves for, I think, changes. In other words, in terms of cultural diplomacy, I think the traditional method, traditional approaches, we have to make way for new changes. What I mean here, as I see it, in the civil societies will be having a greater role in shaping the life of nations. That is now happening. We are seeing that, and the future is even greater. So, in other words, what this means is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs need to work with civil societies also, with other ministries, of course, with the academia, for example, in how to forge better relations between people and people. I think the traditional pattern where the diplomacy is mainly in the hands of established institutions, namely the political establishment, the economic establishment, and the defense management, that is going to make way for people to people relationships, and the fact that the modern phenomena of tourism is, in other words, it's not just we going to other countries, but people come to Malaysia to see for themselves. So I think that is my point. So, for example, I'm from the academia. Now, of course, I observe that right now there are about, I think, 5 chairs established by the Malaysian authorities. One is a private chair. See, it's quite an interesting development. Before, it's all government sponsored chairs in different parts of the United States, for example, in Australia, New Zealand. But the the private sector in Malaysia now has already the one at Georgetown where I used to be. That was not set up by the government. That was set up by the private sector. So actually, academic chairs can play such a wonderful role in promoting cultural diplomacy in different parts of the world.
I wish we had more time to actually delve into this topic. We've only touched the barest surface of cultural diplomacy, but I'm sorry to say that this is all the time we have for tonight. But before we go, let me just thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Malaysia, the Institute of Diplomacy and Foreign Relations, and ISIS Malaysia, who collaborated to bring us together here. And of course, our distinguished panelists, Professor Osman, Dr. Asma, and Mr. Edin Koo, for making this episode possible. And of course, thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Until next time, that's it from us.